Well, welcome back to another episode. This time it is the Mazda MX-5 or the Unos Roadster or the Miata or the Mazda Roadster, depending on which market you're in. Launched in 1989, great year. This is one of those cars that I'm kind of looking forward to doing the generations video on. I know the buyer's guides that we've done are very, very popular. You can check those out after. There is one for the third generation and the second generation on the channel. I actually sold the third generation brand new at a Mazda dealer, so I will put my hands up at the very start. I don't normally do this, but I'll put my hands at the start. The third generation is my favourite. Now, there is an irony to the MX-5 that we'll go through over its generations, and that is that when it first comes to be, 1989, it actually was about 15 years earlier that the idea for the MX-5 came about. However, in 1989, it was entering a world where this sort of car was just being dropped left, right and centre. It really didn't have a lot of competitors that were true roadsters, budget cars that were there for fun and enjoyment and not to set sort of lap records or anything else. And funny enough, over its now 35-year lifespan, it's the last man standing. It came into the market, it entered just as the sort of British sports cars of the day, the MGB and stuff like that, had got a bit long in the tooth and had lost popularity, and the MX-5 came in, refreshed that market. It did well in the UK, which I think, well, actually, I know was quite special to Mazda. Mazda always knew that if there was one market that was going to be the toughest to crack, it was the one that had started it all, because there would be loyalty, of course, to the original brands, and there would be a feeling that if they didn't do it right, the British would tell them. Now, whereas the Americans were desperately calling out for this sort of vehicle to show up and fill the gap that the British were leaving behind, Mazda managed to do it, and being able to do it by convincing the American market, the British market, and then the Japanese market, along with the world markets, that this was the car that they wanted if they wanted something small, fun, and a budget-friendly option compared to, the sort of Ferrari and Porsche options of the day. This was the car. Now, 3 decades later, after fending off competition, you had the Toyota MR2 come in. You've had several German manufacturers try. You've had some of the Japanese manufacturers enter this smaller roadster market. And even the British, the MGTF, which was the sort of the successor in many ways to the sort of earlier roadster cars, actually comes into the market, goes away, and then comes back. So when I sold the Mark III generation, the TF model came back into the UK market. Not many people know that because it wasn't a very good seller, but it had been away for about 5 years. The Chinese, I think it was SAIC, then bought MG and then said, well, why don't we keep the TF going? So it came back in for a couple of years, didn't do that well, because the MX-5 was such a convincing car. Rather than talking more about the MX-5 model, why don't I just jump straight into the first generation? Now, I'll just give you a quick note. The first generation is the NA generation, the second generation is the NB generation, the third generation is the NC, and the last generation is the ND. Now that is the model coding. So if you're looking around on the markets and you go into sort of forums and people are saying, oh, I've got an NB version, they're saying they have a second generation. You'll also notice people will say they have, say, an NC.2. All that means is they've got the refreshed or the facelift version of the third generation. So first generation NA, second generation NB, third generation NC, fourth generation ND. Let's move in to the first generation, the NA, and where it all starts, 1989. So interestingly, this car actually starts off as a concept called the Duo 101. It's between a ex-car journalist that's working for Mazda and one of Mazda's, at the time I think he's the chief executive, so it's Yamamoto, and he's not the chief executive, he is the chief design executive, I believe. So Yamamoto and a ex-journalist called Hall, two of them get together, they start down this road, and the thing with the first generation is, we'll go into the engine and stuff in a moment, but we have to really appreciate when it launched, it was as if there was a new great Ferrari that had entered the market, because journalist after journalist, press organisation after press organisation just leapt at the feet of the MX-5, and there wasn't such a thought that they had taken the baton on from the British manufacturers of the day. It was more that they'd taken the baton and just run away with it. They'd hit the goal in every perspective. The only thing, and this Really, if you're a bit taller, this is going to apply to the first and second generation. It is tight in a first generation. Okay, so if you are sat there and you're thinking, okay, yeah, I'd really like one of these, that'd be great. And you're, say, 6'1", 6'2", I just don't fit in a first generation or a second generation. If we ever had them come in for trade, I had to get my Brazilian colleague Felipe. He used to come and give them a run up the road because I simply couldn't move the steering wheel around my legs. So yeah, if you're over 6'3", this can be a real challenge. If you're 6 foot, so sort of 183 centimeters, if you're working in metric, you're probably just about fit on the first generation and into the second generation. But there is a bit of a height limitation because they are a bit tighter in the cockpit. So just something to be aware of when you're in there. There are many special editions. There is also a 4-speed auto in the first generation. However, unless you physically cannot drive a manual gearbox, I'd go for the manual. The auto is made by a company called Jatco. They are it's Mazda, Nissan and Ford sort of got together, started a transmission company or bought part of a transmission company in Japan. Can't quite remember the exact details, but so it's their automatic that comes in. And you know what? It's not the worst in the world. Had one come in once. Again, I hadn't really driven it. I just moved it around the dealer. But you know, if you cannot drive a manual for whatever reason, and you would love to get into a Mark 1, there is the 4-speed auto option. They're generally unloved, and so you probably can get a bargain on them, but they were rare in the first instance, so just something to bear in mind. Now, the two engines that you have is a 1.6 and a 1.8. 1.6, 116 brake horsepower, 1.8, 128 brake horsepower. So I would say the purchase on these should really be made on condition. They can suffer from rust. It will come up along the rear of the sill and into the rear wheel arch, or the front of the rear wheel arch. So that's the real sort of problem area to check. You have to forgive these cars, being that they'll be between 30 and 35 years, for having sort of some body corrosion and things like that, because they've been around for a very, very long time. And I honestly don't think, from the training that I got on MX-5s when I was working at Mazda, it wasn't that obvious that when Mazda launched this, they really thought these were going to become, you know, classic cars to be kept for decades and decades. I think the idea at the time was more, let's get into the market with something well priced, sporty, and just hope for the best. And maybe we'll get a couple of generations out of it. There really wasn't the idea, and to be honest, Mazda kind of work like this anyway. They're a little bit of one of those renegade companies of the car industry. They kind of have an idea and then they run with it. You know, that's what happened with the rotary engines. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily lend itself to the greatest of business plans and lifespan plans. And it's why Mazdas don't fall into the same sort of category as some of the German manufacturers that you can almost guarantee, like clockwork, will replace a car every 6 to 7 years on the button. They'll do a facelift in the middle of it, and unless there is some great regulation change, they won't really do anything else. Mazda aren't really like that. Between the two engines, I would look at a 1.8. However, if you get a 1.6, you know, there's plenty of tuning companies out there that can bump up the power. But honestly, these cars weigh 1,000 kilos, you know, 2,200 pounds. They're not heavy cars, and so 116 horsepower, you can still have a lot of fun with that. The tuning behind them is off the scale. Okay, I remember. I think I saw one when I was at the dealers. I'm trying to think, I saw more than one. That was an original car. Quite a lot of people, I'd describe them a little bit like the original Mini, that it's kind of okay to do things to them. And people, you know, the next owners, they're not so worried about the idea that you've modified your MX-5. A little bit like in that same Mini way. It's kind of become part of the culture that unless you've got, you know, something with, say, 10,000 miles on it in pristine condition, everything else is not showroom condition. They have been driven for the purpose of it, and making them better where you can, not really a big problem with it. And this is probably why there is a company in the UK called BBR. They will offer a tuning package, I think, in almost every generation. Not so much the second generation. I can't think of the one, probably because of the MazdaSpeed model. We'll get onto that in a moment. But in this generation, the 1.6, they offer a turbo kit for it, or they did at the time, 150 horsepower. And 150 horsepower per tonne, essentially, is what that car was kicking out. that will be a thrill like you probably haven't experienced on the road in many other vehicles. You cannot get away from lightness. It's the old Lotus idea of, just add lightness, and that will get you a lot further than just adding power. So yeah, on this first generation, I'd buy on condition. I wouldn't buy so much on wanting a particular engine or power. One thing to note, 1991, there is a special edition. It's British Racing Green. If you're in the US and Canada, you've got about 4,500 in total, but it's not that special apart from the paintwork. If you're in the UK, that was a particularly special model, but there was only about 250 of them. Different wheels, different seats, different specification for the whole car. So that brings us to the end of the first generation. Let's go to the second generation. And in the second generation, to me, this was the unloved generation. You see, whilst the NA generation, the first one, will always be the original, it will always be coveted because it was the first. In the second generation, it kind of falls into an odd sort of quagmire at the moment, whereas the third generation, that we'll come on to a little bit later, that one at the moment, you can get those at real bargains across the used market. A 2005, 2006, 2007 model is a bargain to buy, and they were a little bit larger. They're a little bit more accommodating for people that want to use the car a little bit more often than they do just sort of a weekend car. The second generation, it falls into that sort of tough middle ground. It's kind of in that modern classics world, but because buyers will pay that bit of extra to go into the first generation, you'll find that this generation, at the moment at least, it may be the one suffering with the most amount of problems when you're looking on the used market, because there is a little bit of, if you spend money on a Mark 1, especially if you are modifying it and doing whatever, I'm not saying you're going to get your money back, but there will be an appreciation, there will be a market for it. In the second generation, if you get handed a bill that is half the price of the car, you kind of know you're not getting that money back. And because of that, I know these are maturing and they are getting a little bit more popular. But certainly when I was selling the new NCs, these were just kind of unloved used cars. And I'll be honest, it was actually difficult to find ones that we could put on the forecourt. Maybe a 2004 or 2003, sort of the last of them, were really the only ones that we could ever retail. They'd just fallen into that point in time where they'd had their depreciation. There was a new one out. This is sort of around that time where we're sort of pre-financial crisis when these end. A lot of people buy up with the new third generation. It answers a lot of consumer questions. Whereas in the second generation, there had been a sort of slight demand slip. So on the used market, you're going to have a bit more of a challenge in that there will be quite a few available, but finding a good one, finding one that's been well kept, that's had good history, either with a specialist or with a dealer. And I will say, unlike a lot of cars where I say, you can go to a specialist, that's absolutely fine. You can on these, of course. There are some great specialists out there who really make all of their money, all of their business from MX-5s. However, the dealers actually, and a lot of the technicians at the dealers, they really enjoyed these cars. They enjoyed working on them. And so, that even as they got 10, 15 years old, there was always, we had our head mechanic, and he always worked on the MX-5s when they were outside of a 5-year window because he knew them, he enjoyed working on them. And so, you got sort of the top guy every time, and you weren't charging the extra for it. So just a little tip there. Don't look down on one that's full dealer history because you think a specialist will know more. Actually, a lot of the time, there'll be someone there who loves these and has sort of said, look, if it's over XYZ generations, I'm taking care of it. Just something to note. And so let's go into the models that you're looking at. Again, it's a 1.6 and a 1.8. 1.6 is 108 brake horsepower until you get to the facelift in 2001, goes up to 123 brake horsepower. We can put the 1.6 off to the side for a moment because that's a fairly true figure no matter where you buy it. In the 1.8, it's 140 brake horsepower and then goes up to 152 brake horsepower on the facelift if you're in Australia, the UK, Europe, Japan. In America, they put that brake horsepower figure, 152, because that's what it had been tested in other markets. However, it only made 143. At the time, Mazda offered owners, and this was because different ways of testing and also different emissions equipment to get it through US regulation, everything else. the answer that Mazda came up with at the time was to say, okay, if you've got one, we will buy it back from you, or you can have free servicing. So a lot of owners just picked the free servicing because they like the car. The fact that, Mazda, I think, made a very genuine mistake here. This wasn't like they were trying to rip people off, tell them they were one figure when they were another. This seemed like Mazda making a fairly genuine mistake. And it is a reminder. A lot of people think, BMW, Mazda, Volkswagen, Toyota, they just put them all in the same brush and say, well, these are all car manufacturers. Mazda is quite different to most car manufacturers. They are still, I would say, family owned, but they're owned by themselves. They have their own way of working. They have a relatively modest office in Japan. They aren't some huge conglomerate, and they don't have some of the funding that comes with being a public company and being much larger. I would say, much like some of those British sports cars that we talked about, they were punching above their weight, and they always have been. And because of that, have been renowned across the world. But it does mean that sometimes, they can make silly small mistakes, and it is actually very genuine. They aren't trying to dupe anyone. And I do believe that this was the case on this second generation. I think they just made a very honest mistake. However, the US cannot be that upset. The same with the Aussies as well. But the US get the only, and this is, so the second generation gets the MazdaSpeed for 2004 and into 2005 on the second generation. It's the ND MazdaSpeed model. In Australia, it is the MX-5 SE model, and they take off most of the MazdaSpeed badging apart from the exhaust from memory. 178 brake horsepower from a factory turbocharged model. So yes, okay, they didn't get all their figures right if you're going for a naturally aspirated one. However, to have a turbocharged one from factory, the US have got to celebrate that. Not everyone got a MazdaSpeed model. As I said, the Aussies, they get the MX-5 SE model. That's kind of a sort of a very, very similar specification. Same, I think they have 160, 161 brake horsepower, so slight power difference as well. But still get the turbocharged model, just not full MazdaSpeed. If you're looking for one, I would probably look, aside from the turbocharger ones, they will have their own market and they'll have their own sort of pricing to go with it. If you're looking for a second generation, I'd try and go facelift if I can. A little bit more power. Mazda revised a few of the kinks from the earlier model. The only exception to that is the 10th anniversary model that comes out in 1999. That will probably be a little bit special to go ahead. It's the first time Mazda sort of roll out this special edition of 10th birthday, if you like. I was around when they did the 20th model, and I know within the company it was special. It isn't just another special edition, it is special to them. So if you can find a 10th anniversary model, you've got a little bit of Mazda history there. So let's move on to the NC generation. I just want to add on just a very quick bit of information. If you do get one of those 10th anniversary models, they should come with a certificate of authenticity. I knew I was going to mess that up. Certificate of authenticity, okay, is what they should come with. If they don't have that, I would speak to either the Mazda dealer or ask your local Mazda dealer who they have as a representative that can make sure that car you are buying is one of those 10th anniversary models and can get you a copy of the authenticity certificate. It is important, especially on the modern classics, sort of the used market and into the sort of the classic car auctions. If an owner hasn't got it, I want to know why. So just an FYI on that one. Now, the NC generation. I'm not going to hide it. It's my favourite generation because I sold it. And when you're selling cars, especially at main dealers, sometimes you do have to put in 7-day work weeks. Sometimes you'll put in a 14-day work week. If it's a particularly busy month, you have to hit your target. And it can be very challenging. Anyone who's watching this who's ever sold cars will know. You're not complaining about the work, but if you're sort of getting in at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning and you're not going home until 7 p.m. and you're doing that day in, day out to try and get a target, it can be a bit of a slow, gloomy, especially in the winter, few days or weeks for you. And then someone comes in and says, I'd like to test drive one of the MX-5s, please. And you drop the roof, if you can, if it's not raining, which, and it brightens up the day. Okay, and I think it's the best way to describe an MX-5, but it's what I really noticed in this third generation, and it will live with me. And the fact that Mazda made the car slightly bigger, it is the largest of all the MX-5s. It means if you are very tall, you can just about squeeze in there. You know, it's still very challenging. I think we used to tell people, funny enough, one of the conversation pieces was the boot, when you lifted it, it had little additional spaces sort of in the corners, and that was so that you could get golf clubs in the boot. It's just a funny addition that Mazda sort of realised. They had a customer base, but that customer base was kind of saying, oh, you know, if I could do this and that, you know, this is my car that I have fun in. And yeah, this third generation, I don't know, it represented, I think, everything that Mazda had always wanted the MX-5 to represent, and it's how they had originally launched the car in 1989. And as the years go by, you know, you do have to get on with the cold, hard act of selling a car, but you've got to also make sure that there's a little bit of joy. And in the second generation, they managed to do that, but they realised that there was a risk in that second generation of it just becoming, you know, the tough follow-up that the market would then start to ease off. You see this a lot with vehicles. They come in, great celebration over them. Just look at EVs over the last decade, you know, huge celebration over them. People want to try out new technology, see what it's like. And then, you know, that initial burst of excitement goes away, and they're either just part of the sort of backdrop of the car world, or they fizzle out and people buy them less and less. And particularly with sports cars, it is probably why so many Roadsters had failed before. People got very excited about them, went out and bought them early on, and then the second generation comes along, and then the third generation, and before you know it, people have said, I'm not as interested as I once was. And so this was that car that had to deliver. And honestly, from the feedback at least that I had when I sold them, it did. So which one should you buy? That's the big question, isn't it? Well, as many of you all know, this is the first generation to get a folding hardtop, or to get this retractable hardtop that it changes the dynamics of who can buy the car. There were criticism previously that if you lived in a city, it was difficult with the canvas roof. People, especially on the older ones, could sort of put a knife through them and steal stuff out the car. Not such a big issue as we go into the early 2000s, but you know, only because the material gets so much better, it's not that easy to do anymore. However, people are a little bit tired of taking care of soft tops, and so offering the retractable folding hardtop, that I would say it splits most of the market, but not in the way you think. If you're looking at a 1.8 model, the majority I would say will be a soft top, because that's still the sort of the pure model. Okay, 1.8s generally, from what I sold, were fairly regular specification. People didn't put a lot of optional extras on them. They didn't go for sort of the wild expensive paint either. They were just looking to have a car they could enjoy. They went for a 1.8, and they weren't going to pay the extra to have the folding hardtop, because a soft top was perfectly acceptable. And we have to address the elephant in the room. The weight had gone up on the third generation. It is the heaviest of all the generations, but we've got to put it into perspective. We're talking about, you know, 1,150-ish kilos, 1,100 kilos, like 2,400 pounds. So yes, it's heavier. It's the equivalent probably of carrying a passenger in the first generation, but it is bigger for it. And there are, you know, a lot of other features that had to be put into this car. It's not all of Mazda's doing. There was going to be a huge change in regulations that Mazda had to jump through to get this car out to the market, and that did add weight, but it also makes it safer. So there are a few things to take into consideration there. If you want the folding hardtop, I would say when I was selling them, if it was a 2 litre, it was around a 2-to-1 ratio. So for every 2 litre I sold, or for every 3 I sold, 2 of them would be the folding hardtop. Because generally, when people were spending a bit more money to go for the 2 litre, they went, well, I might as well have the specification. Was it the Sport Tech model? I think was very, very popular for us. So it was that model that used to get particular attention. Over on the soft top, you do have the option for it if you go for the 2 litre. Just be aware there's I say, about 1/3 of all of them. Okay. They are both MZR platform engines. It's 126 brake horsepower on the 1.8. It's 167 brake horsepower on the 2 litre. Again, BBR, I think they only build a couple of hundred of their BBR 270 models, but it is a bit of a platform as to what can be done with these. 268 brake horsepower from a turbocharged 2 litre engine. So that is one of the options if you want huge power. To put it into perspective, the brake horsepower per tonne on the BBR model is something very, very similar to the Porsche Carrera 997 generation S Cabrio. Long sentence, I know, but basically, say a 2007 convertible Carrera S 911 model, brake horsepower per tonne, if you go for that BBR model, they are quite rare, but just to give you a sort of perception of what you'd be buying power-wise, it is about the same brake horsepower per tonne as what they were offering in the 911. They are ludicrously fast. We had one, I'm not sure actually if it was a BBR, but it was turbocharged that used to come into the dealer and be serviced, and it was only like 2 years old, so not sure. I think the owner had just decided he wanted to go full out. We did have a lot of engineering companies around us, so I think he might have been part of one of those, but that thing went out on it once after it had been serviced, went out with the technician, he had to run it up the road and back, and it just, I don't know, it flew, basically. It's just, there's fast cars and then there's quick cars, and it was still a quick car rather than what you'd say, you know, fast cars feel like they're a bit relentless. You're going to just go way past the speed limit and keep going. This felt like it wanted to throw you up the speed limit and then leave the decision up to you whether you really wanted to push any further. But for the regular engines, the 1.8, 126 brake horsepower, perfectly acceptable on the road. And to be honest, from taking people out on test drive, some people would be a bit between them. You'd go out in the first 1.8, and what you'd find is people would drive the car a little bit harder. They'd be up sort of 5,500 on the rev range. When you then go out in the 2 litre, people would be shifting more at like 4,000 RPM. Just because you have more torque in the engine, you have a bit more power, they didn't need to sort of sing it out as far. They were also on a test drive, so while they wanted to test the car, they didn't want to go probably as keen as they might have gone if I wasn't sat next to them. But it just sort of gives you a bit of a perception as to what these cars are like power-wise. I'll give you my opinion on it, and because I got to choose, and I think I had a 1.8 for like a week once, had a 2 litre convertible, the soft top convertible for a couple of weeks. But the one I picked to have for my 3 months, so we got cars for 3 months as demonstrators, was the exact car that I'd suggest you go for. And it's the 2 litre with the folding hardtop with some of the specification, like Sport Tech model, so you get the Bose sound system, leather seats, heated seats. It makes a huge difference on to how often you can use the car. If you have heated leather seats, you've got the heater, you get the wind deflector that goes between the seats at the top, and a Sport Tech model with a 2 litre engine. It will cruise up in 6th gear, up the motorway to some nice roads. When you get there, you drop the roof, and it can be cold, but you've got the heated seats on, you've got the blowers on, and you can go and enjoy, you know, the world out there. And that does change the usage case of an MX-5, because most people just buy them and enjoy them on those sort of spring and summer days. You go for something like the 2 litre with the folding hardtop, with the specification, you can enjoy it day to day, you know. And on one of those really sort of chilly autumn days, or very, very early spring where there's still a bit of frost around and people aren't quite ready to take their car out, you can go for a run out in yours. So I would say it does. Unlike a lot of these cars where I sort of say, the 1.8 will still be fun, and it will be. But if you want to extend the amount of time over the course of a year, you can really enjoy the car. Yeah, it'd be that one that I'd pick. There were quite a few optional extras on these, just as an FYI. Most people didn't pick them. They would pick the spec, and then they wouldn't add things to them. But Mazda did offer quite a lot of options. So if you find one that does look a little bit different to all the rest and someone's saying, it's all Mazda options, it probably is, just as an FYI. That brings us to the end of the NC, or the 3rd generation. Let's go on to the current generation, I should say, the ND. Now, there's quite a few things I want to say about the ND generation. However, I will just remind you, if you're enjoying the video, click subscribe. There's lots more of these coming up, or consider becoming a channel member if you want to support the channel. With that out the way, this is probably the first. I'm just trying to think if I know of any other car that does this, because on the ND generation, Mazda strip 100 kilograms or 100 kilos out of the car, 200-ish pounds. So it's just shy of 100 kilos actually. And that's base spec to base spec, because There are a couple of other additional things. And of course, we have another hardtop or a sort of Targa model coming in. I'll come on to that in just a moment. But it's one of the first times you see this in this modern era, to move from 2015 cars into a 2016 car and it be lighter. I can't think of any manufacturer that was able to do that. I mean, Range Rover did it, actually, thinking about it, but that was only because they took a lot of weight out the car by shifting over to aluminium. The car was, 2.7 tons beforehand, so stripping 300 kilos, 400 kilos out of it made it lighter, but we're still talking about, a big, heavy car in the first place. When you've got one of the lightest cars on the market, and when I was selling the NC, it really was. There wasn't really anything that competed out there for weight. To get 100 kilos out of it, now it is 4 inches shorter in total, so it's about 10 centimeters shorter, so there is a little bit of a gain there. Mazda also, they had to go quite heavy on the NC for regulators. Okay, so there was a lot of new rules coming in that were not that well communicated, if I'm honest. Across the world, they weren't that well communicated. One country was saying one thing, one region was saying another, and I think Mazda just went, well, we'll just chuck it all into all of them, and that way we can't get this wrong, because they really couldn't afford to get it wrong. We wouldn't have a 4th generation if it wasn't for the fact that the 3rd did so well across so many markets to so many people. Okay, so, it's become harder and harder to make a business case for a small roadster that is the right price, but we have it. Okay, and as of the making of this video, we still have the ND generation that can be bought brand new. So if you're in the UK, £29,000. If you're in the USA, about 29.5 or 28, sorry, £1,000, £28,500. If you're in the US, about $29,000. If you're in Australia, about $46,000. Okay, that's for the base model. From there, it steps up. And if you're looking for the RF, it is going to be more money. I think there is a premium of around 25% addition to step up. I did just notice, actually, I've been saying RF for the 3rd generation as well, which I think actually is RC when I sold it, but I could be wrong. So sorry about that. I'm trying to hold quite a lot of facts up in my head here. So yeah, if I've got that wrong, apologies. But yes, we do have a true soft top and an RF model. This, I would say, is more like a Targa than it is, because you've got the actual bodywork sort of, it comes up to the back of the shoulder, unlike on the previous generation where you just have a metal folding hardtop. This, they actually changed the body style at the back if you're going for a hardtop. Bit of I think style-wise, I actually really like it with the hardtop Targa, shorter area. And again, if you're looking at use cases, if you're in a warm climate, great. Maybe you don't care so much about being a bit more exposed with the soft top being folded back. If you're not in such a if you're in a colder climate more often, so most of Europe, maybe having that little bit more of a cocoon around you might just make it a little bit more comfortable. Anyway, I just want to explain one thing about the ND, because yes, you can still buy these brand new today, which I don't think is really appreciated. So there's 3 refreshes that have happened. There had to be a refresh in 2023, and people might be taking for granted what the MX-5 has become. The 4th generation probably would have never have happened if there hadn't been a tie-up with Fiat Chrysler, and that was to give the Abarth 124 and the Fiat 124, I think there were the 2, so the Abarth 124 Spider, that helped Mazda be able to jump through the regulators that got the ND to market, because in about 2016, 2017, it's widely recognised by most of the industry that they were the largest regulation change in the car industry since the 1970s. Okay, so where there had been sort of incremental, making things a little bit better for about 40 years, they hit the car industry hard. And this is why when I sold cars, they weren't cheap at the time, but they were good budget cars. You could buy a car for what I would say is probably half, maybe just shy of half of the UK's national average salary. The same was true in the US, the same was true in Australia. You could go out, look at whatever half of the nation's median average or whatever, however it's calculated, and you could say, well, I want to buy a car for exactly half that, and I want it to be brand new, and I want it to be reasonable. I don't want it to be just sort of the cheapest nonsense that's not going to last me very long. You know, I sold that. The Mazda 2, we had a model that you could buy for just less than £10,000. Even the nicer ones really didn't step up too much. It was a couple of £1,000s more. After 2016, there was a bit of a reprieve. If manufacturers had already invested in a car, then they could keep that car going for a bit longer, keep the prices fairly stagnant. But a lot of people think that 2020 is the big changing moment for cars. I've explained in previous videos that car manufacturers, I think this was in the video of why are cars so expensive. You can check that out afterwards, but I say there, it was actually a structural idea behind most car companies. They were going to start charging more money. But the real inception for that was from 2016. Cheap cars were going to be almost impossible to sell because the regulators had decided, no, you can't sell this car at this price anymore because you're going to have to fit so many additional technology and features that once you add them into the supply chain, you're not going to make any money on cheap cars. And manufacturers stood by it for a little while and then they stopped taking the losses. And that's why now it's very hard to find any car that is less than the sort of median average salary for the whole year from any manufacturer that isn't just entering the market and trying to grab a bit of market share by coming in cheaply. So a little bit of, I'm just trying to sort of paint the picture of what the ND generation MX-5 came into. It was going to be rough running. And let's say if they hadn't got that additional investment to really make this fourth generation a true sort of MX-5 car, bearing in mind, just as a quick aside, you know, the, Porsche, big company, yeah? No one looks at a 911 and says, oh, that comes from a little small manufacturer. They've had to drop the 718 models, this is the Boxster and the Cayman, in Europe because of hacking laws that have come in about the modules on the cars, okay? They've had to drop the model, and Mazda have been able to just about get themselves through enough hoops to keep selling the MX-5. That I'm just putting it out there that if you're looking to buy an ND and you've got the, you know, the financial ability at the moment to look at one brand new, you may just want to support the company that one last time because I'm really not sure how far this can go. I know the next one will be electrified. That'll probably just be some sort of small hybrid system that they put in there. But it's a challenge for Mazda, and they're not selling that many MX-5s anymore. Okay, so that's just the intro to the ND generation. Don't want to make it too depressing, but want to put it into context of how much of an achievement it was that we still had the car. Because even though the third generation had been a success, the regulations that were coming in on the fourth generation were making it a colossal challenge. But from that, hey, Abarth got a great looking car. And if you like sort of the 124 Spider model, you think, oh, I'd really like an MX-5, but I'd like something that just looked a little bit more, you know, Italian, a little bit more stylish out there. Rough function, a little bit less, but I want it to just look. You didn't have to make the compromise. You got basically an MX-5 chassis underneath, little few tweaks and changes here and there, different engine, but you got that with a great body on top. And so far, those cars seem to have been fairly, well, they seem to go fairly well and seem to last. Wasn't that many of them sold though. So, you know, that's just an off to the side. So, ND generation, what do we have? Sky active engines on both of them. 1.5 has 129 brake horsepower and the 2 litre has 181 brake horsepower. The fastback one, again, that sort of takes sort of the retractable fastback. That takes more of the 2 litre market. You're not going to find that many 1.5s with the fastback style, the hard top on top. You're going to find more of them in convertible, kind of following what happened in the third generation. The purists kind of said, no, the smaller engine is absolutely fine for me because I can actually thrash it on the road without worrying about a policeman chasing after me and taking my license away in front of me. And at the same time, it sort of kept with what these cars were all the way back from the beginning. The 2 litre, 181 horsepower, a retractable hardtop, or the fastback, you know, version of it. I would say that just makes it such a good sports car. You know, it's a roadster, yes, but it moves it over. You know, you're looking at brake horsepower per ton, you're looking at what's out there, you're looking at how capable that MX-5 is. Yes, it is more money, But it may be that if you've had faster cars before and you're saying, really like an MX-5, everyone talks about them, but I don't really know, if I want to be thrashing a car every 5 seconds, look at the 2 litre. You'll be very, very surprised. Brake horsepower per tonne is quite incredible, and there are not that many cars. If you step up to, say, what's a hatchback? Volkswagen Golf R, 300 horsepower, but because of its weight, you're actually looking at more like 170 horsepower per tonne, 180 horsepower per tonne. Well, that's kind of what you've got here in the MX-5. So just to give it, some sort of follow-up there. I think actually I'm being a bit unfair to the R. I think it's more like 200 horsepower per tonne. But moving weight, even if your brake horsepower per tonne is the same, it still has a penalty. Every time you corner, you're still feeling that weight penalty. Models that I would pick, I think it just comes down to how you like to drive your car. And honestly, the 1.5, you think, 1.5 in a little car like this, no, that doesn't really sound sporty enough for me. Go and drive it. It will probably take you by surprise. Okay. Now, saying all of that, if you want something that is special in this generation, and I think this will become a very special car onto the classic scene in the future, and it's for a variety of reasons. And if you're a real car enthusiast and you've loved cars for years, this will make sense immediately. There was a launch edition of the RF model, okay, 2 litre engine, and it has BBS wheels and Recaro seats. Now, when I sold Mazdas, we had Recaro seats in the last run of the RX-8, the R3 model. Many manufacturers, particularly German manufacturers, have had Recaro seats and BBS of a wheel manufacturer that have gone into several OEMs over the years. Unfortunately, because of the world we live in and because of the pressure and demand on these car parts, both of those companies look like they will not survive. And so if you have an RF launch edition model, you will not only have this 2-tone paint, either Soul Red or what do they call it? Something metallic grey. There's a metallic grey. You can tell me in the comments which grey it is. 2-tone, black mirrors, I think black wheels, black roof at the roof part of the RF, and let's say Recaro seats and BBS wheels, and that is something just truly, truly special. Not going to be repeated by the looks of it ever again. And those two companies have not only had part of Mazda history, but they've had part of several companies' histories, and to be both in there on the launch model of the RF, if you can find one, you'll have something truly special, but you will pay a premium for it. I'll end on just telling you that you may have heard me say all this and not be convinced. Well, if you're a big fan of sort of car motoring press, this car won World Car of the Year back in 2016. Jeremy Clarkson wrote that this was the antidote for depression, I think it was, he said, and that you just couldn't be upset or depressed or miserable driving one of these MX-5s. He just said it was a fantastic car and that everyone should go out and drive one. I think it made into the top 10 several years in a row from all of the big car magazines out there, and it just won a series of awards. So you don't have to take my word for it. There are plenty of people out there that will tell you this is the car. If you want something as an antidote to the world that we live in of big heavy SUVs and you just want to enjoy driving, then you need an MX-5 in your life. I'll leave you with that. Next week, I think actually in a few days, probably if I can get the schedule right, we're going to do the Porsche Boxster next. So if you're interested in that one, then hang around for that, subscribe, and I'll see you then. Otherwise, have a great day and take care.